I've said many times on this channel that the best way to deal damage in ESO is to build for damage and nothing else. Don't make the common mistake of putting points into health or equipping heavy armor. Don't focus on survivability or sustain unless you have to. It generally makes the game harder and slows you down. Focus on damage and almost everything becomes easier and more fun. I stand by that, but it doesn't mean we have to be super squishy and die all the time. It's fine to die in video games, it can be funny or even motivating, but obviously it's not the goal. And I see so many players getting clapped by things that are easily survivable, especially during the recent Writhing Wall and Witches Festival events. And this is not a skill issue, guys. I guess just a lot of people don't realize how tanky you can get in this game without compromising on damage. Hence this video. This is Khan, you're watching Ninja Pulls. I make a lot of DPS and rotation guides for trials and dungeons, but I don't tend to make solo builds. I'll share tips with anyone who asks, but one of the advantages of playing solo is to build around our personal strengths and preferences as players. So this video is not about me giving you a build. Sure, if you want to start soloing DLC dungeon trifectas, you're going to need a specialized build or two. But we're not talking about that, we're just talking about a damage dealer with a thick enough skin that they can solo everyday things like siege camps, event bosses, Mirror incursions, some of the nastier world bosses, and obviously solo arenas. You really don't need a special build for that, not anymore. Just 4 tricks to give your existing build more survivability, without necessarily taking any focus away from damage. Sound good? Here we go. The armor buff, Major Resolve. The damage buffs, Major Brutality, Sorcery, Prophecy, and Savagery. Potions, which restore both damage resources, potentially health as well, like the potions you'd use on a tank. And finally, Food, which increases your max health as well as your primary resource. There are other tools like the Reaving Blow slottable, Pragmatic Fate Carver, Puncturing Sweep, Critical Surge. These can all be super useful if you need a little extra, but for now, let's stick with these 4 because they're pretty universal. In fact, ever since hybridization, which, guys, is going to be 4 years ago soon, points 2, 3, and 4 have become increasingly common. And if you play a lot of trials at an organized level, you've probably already had these covered for a long time. But the mid-game can be slow to modernize, and clearly many players just don't realize this is a thing, either because they don't do trials that often, or because they're prioritizing damage and nothing else, which is, in many ways, the smart approach. The thing is, none of these will reduce your damage, not necessarily, unless your build is very out of date, in which case you should gain quite a lot of damage by incorporating these things, but for the vast majority, we're talking about tweaks to your existing build. The fundamentals, the gear, abilities, mundus, champion points, and even the rotation can stay the same. Start with Major Resolve. It's a buff which is very easy to get, every class has a unique source, and it grants almost 6k armor. Remember, the armor cap is 33k, so this is close to a fifth of the total mitigation available to us through armor. Obviously, there are other sources of mitigation as well, but we're not making a tank or a PvP build, just a damage dealer with a thick skin. If your character is rocking mostly medium armor, which it should be, you're probably sitting on at least 12k armor already, so Major Resolve will take you right up to 18k. That is plenty for PvE, and frankly, way more than you need in overworld content. But that extra 6k from Major Resolve knocks about 10% off all incoming hits. In fact, in testing, I found it was often more like 12%. That's not going to save you from a 30k one-shot, but the really big hits are generally blockable, dodgeable, or otherwise avoidable. What we cannot avoid are the constant smaller ticks like dots and light attacks, and reducing all of those by 10% can make a major difference in our ability to ignore incoming damage or outvalue it with passive healing and shields. The issue is that not every subclassing combo has Major Resolve. It often sits in skill lines which are more geared towards tanking, and which are not really attractive to damage dealers, and if we sacrifice a damage skill line for something like Draconic Power or Restoring Light, then suddenly we are losing damage in the name of survivability, which is the opposite of what we want to do here. There are 3 ways around this. 1. Grab the Sorcerer's Stormcalling skill line and use Hurricane. This is a damage ability worth using even without the Major Resolve. and it sits in a skill line with excellent passives and other useful tools like Critical Surge. This skill line is generally amazing for soloing at the moment, and I've got it on a bunch of my characters. 2. If you need the Major Resolve, but you aren't in a position to get it, you can use Balance from the Mages Guild. This isn't ideal because it's really not a damage skill, but it will help your Magicka sustain as a nice bonus. And 3. Don't bother with Major Resolve. Especially if you're using something like Pragmatic Fate Carver, you can often skip it. When testing for this video, I was actually surprised at how much stuff I could survive without it, especially if the fight is all mechanics and DPS checks. But if the fight is putting pressure on you through incoming damage, then Major Resolve might be needed. The 2 Witches Festival bosses are actually very good and current examples. I soloed both of them with and without Major Resolve. Lord Hollowjack is a slog either way, but he doesn't hit very hard, so the extra armor was helpful but unnecessary. The Crowborn Horror, on the other hand, is much easier to solo in general, but the incoming damage is much higher, and I immediately felt very squishy and vulnerable without Major Resolve. It's up to you how you want to play it. If you've got an open slot in your armory system, you can always have one loadout with Storm Calling for this kind of stuff, and another for dungeons and trials with whatever skill lines you want. Anytime you're with a tank, you should always be getting Major Resolve from them with Frost Cloak, so it's not something you should have to worry about in groups. That was point number 1. I think the remaining 3 are less situational and a bit more universal. Damage buffs. Major Brutality and Sorcery increase our weapon and spell damage by 20%, while Major Prophecy and Savagery increase our critical chance by 12%. These buffs have always been absolutely mandatory for damage dealers, and it used to be standard to get them from potions, Essence of Spell Power, or Weapon Power. But particularly since hybridization, the sources of these buffs have proliferated. There are so many ways we can get them now. Even if the class skill lines you've chosen don't have these buffs, you can still get them with scribed abilities. Here's the list, and you'll see many of these are class abilities we would probably want to use anyway, so they're automatically present, which is great. You can get the buffs from potions instead, but just look how common they've become. And if we can get these buffs just by slotting the right abilities, we can then use whatever potions we want. Which brings us to point number 3 and 4, which both dovetail with the damage buffs. If we can restore both stamina and magicka from potions, as well as boosting both recovery stats, that takes a ton of pressure off our resources, and we're much less likely to be dependent on our buff food for recovery, letting us use buy-stat food, which grants a massive boost to our max health and to our primary resource. Obviously, true survivability requires more than just a large health pool, but again, we're not making a tank or a PvP setup, just a DD with thick skin. And with these 4 tricks, that skin becomes surprisingly thick. A quick note on the specific consumables to use, otherwise people will get mad at me. For potions that restore resources and boost recovery for their duration, we actually have 5 options, all of which are going to work. 1. Crafted potions with magicka and stamina, but no health. 2. Crafted potions with magicka, stamina, and health. 3. Crafted potions with all 3, plus an extra duration on the health recovery. 4. Purchased potions from siege vendors in Cyrodiil, bought with alliance points. And 5. The free crown potions from login rewards and such. Do not buy these with actual crowns, that would be a huge waste. I just mentioned them in case you already have some stashed in the bank. Based on current reagent prices on PC EU, the first 2 options are basically the same cost. So if you're crafting your own potions, you may as well go with option 2. That free heal may come in handy now and then. And it's cheaper than option 3 since Mountain Flower is pretty expensive, and those extra few seconds of health recovery will probably make 0 difference to you since the cooldown is 45 seconds anyway. Reagents like Dragon Blood and Dragon Room are even crazier in price, so I'm not even listing them here. Do not waste those, unless you specifically need heroism potions. And that should only happen if you're in a very ambitious group where everyone is at peak performance. Options 4 and 5 technically have a slightly shorter duration, but again, there's no way you'll ever actually notice that, so use whatever you've got. The main point is to restore all of our resources through potions, so we can use food which gives us max health instead of recovery. For Magicka characters, that means a max level savory recipe. For stamina characters, a max level ragu recipe. Any of the three options will do, so long as it's max level. You can get these recipes from daily crafting writs, or buy them, or the food itself, from guild traders. If you find that you cannot sustain with this food, check your armor ratios and passives, make better use of your off resource, or switch back to a food with resource recovery. Ghastly Eyeball and Lavafoot Soup for pure damage resources, Witch Mothers and Dubious for a bit of health, resource and recovery, but these are a bit of an awkward middle ground, offering you less damage and less survivability. I wouldn't even bother with the gold versions. Clockwork Citrus Fillet and Artaeum Takeaway Broth, they are way more expensive and the stats are only slightly better, so you're very unlikely to ever see the difference. So those are the 4 things I recommend trying. Clearly, not every build can incorporate this stuff as easily. An old school setup with no hybridization and no subclassing is going to struggle to implement these, but in that case, try updating the build and you'll have a much better experience in-game. It is very easy to underestimate the benefits of things like this until you try them, especially when the player base tends to fixate on DPS numbers, and stuff like survivability, sustain, and ease of use don't make an exciting headline. Of course, those benefits are not equally shared across all classes and all skill lines. Subclassing still looks very much like a work in progress, and there are a lot of outstanding balance issues. So it won't be a surprise to anyone that some skill lines are going to perform better than others. Which brings us to some of the other tricks you can use to make your damage dealer even more unstoppable. But before we get to that, and speaking of things that you play solo, a quick word from a sponsor about KAKU Ancient Seal. This is a new Zelda-like ARPG with a gorgeous open world and dynamic combat system which just celebrated its console launch. It's also on Steam for PC. Maya and I streamed it recently and we were genuinely impressed with the vivid environments, the combat, and the slick UX design. I've put the full trailer at the end of the video, so check that out. One survivability trick which is easy to overlook but can be insanely strong is Reaving Blows, a slottable champion point in the warfare tree. It heals you with every tick of direct damage with no cooldown. Think about it, most damage setups these days rely primarily on direct damage. Rune Blades, Bow Procs, Jabs, Flames of Oblivion, Sub-Assault, Blast Bones, Blade Cloak, Hurricane. Even Radiant Oppression and Fate Carver were recently changed to count as direct damage instead of damage over time. So you can get a ton of healing out of this CP in the right situation, especially if you combine it with a rotation and set of abilities which really leverage it for constant healing. The most obvious example is Pragmatic Fate Carver. It's not quite as free as it was, now the Arcanist class mastery script has changed, and we have to flail twice between beams, but the tick rate, the range, cleave, and ease of use are all excellent. And it's the shield which really makes the difference. Sometimes you can even just forget about the flail and just recast the beam on cooldown to perma-shield through incoming damage. And if we combine that with Reaving Blows, we are also healing ourselves throughout. When it comes to giving a DD a thick skin, it's hard to overstate the difference this makes. If you haven't done Maelstrom or Vatashran in a while, or you don't have the trifectas yet, just try them with a setup like this one. The gear doesn't really matter, just medium armor with the 4 tricks we already covered, plus Pragmatic Fate Carver and Reaving Blows. You won't need Pale Order or any active heals, so long as you're careful. Seriously, if like me you played these arenas when they first came out, it feels so weird to do them like this, just shrugging off all the incoming damage and just nuking everything. I've actually been evangelizing this approach ever since subclassing dropped, and I've had messages from so many players saying that this helped them cruise through their first trifecta or their first veteran clear. It's not just the survivability, but the fact that we can just go ham on the damage and melt most things so fast the mechanics can be skipped or ignored. It's kinda crazy what you can get away with. On Twitch, we've even started taking requests from chat for the nastiest world bosses they can think of and seeing how this kind of setup holds up against them. And despite it not being a quote-unquote proper solo build with a bunch of concessions to armor, healing and sustain, it's just a trial DPS setup with slight tweaks, turns out it's genuinely difficult to find many things in Overworld that it can't do. If Reaving Blows isn't quite enough healing for you, or if your rotation is more dot heavy, then the Ring of the Pale Order Mythic is still amazing for solo stuff. Probably overkill for most of the stuff we're talking about here, and like I said, you really don't need it if you're using the shield beam, but it's definitely worth mentioning. Other tools include Critical Surge from Storm Calling, which gives you a constant soft heal in the background whenever you deal critical damage. It's also a source of brutality and sorcery. Just remember you need to cast it to get the buffs, it's not enough just to have it slotted like Inspired Scholarship. Puncturing Strikes can also be very useful. The Magicomorph Puncturing Sweep heals you with every tick. And if your damage stats are in a good spot, that might be as much as 4k per tick and 12k per cast. That's a lot of free healing from a damage ability. Maybe not quite as useful as the shield from Fate Carver, but you can use it in a pretty similar way. If you're on a stamina character, the Stamina Morph Biting Jabs does not have any healing, but it is still direct damage, so it will trigger Reaving Blows 3 times per cast. Plus, it's another source of brutality and sorcery if you need it. There are definitely more class abilities we could talk about: Crux Weaver Armor, Sap Essence. ESO is a very big game with a lot of stuff. But I think we've covered the strongest options for adding survivability without taking our focus away from damage. Like I said at the start, it's your setup, so you do you. Couple of points before we finish: if your penetration stat is low, or you're doing something a bit more serious like dungeons, bring Elemental Susceptibility. That will debuff enemy armor with Major Breach, plus you'll get decent damage and bonus debuffs out of it too. You can use Reaper's Mark from the Nightblade as well. The Burst Heal and the Major Berserk can be very nice, but it's pretty situational and Elemental Susceptibility is a better default. In Overworld, most enemies only have 9.1k armor, so unless your pen is pretty low, I wouldn't even bother with Major Breach for that. Finally, don't forget scribing. We're not going to get deep into it here because there are so many options, but if you feel there are any gaps in your setup, whether it's a buff, you need some extra healing, or you just need something to cast now and then which spends your off resource and takes pressure off your primary resource, remember to look at abilities like Soul Burst, Ulfsild's Contingency, Banner Bearer, whatever. You'll almost always find some way to get what you need. And with that, I think we're all done. If that breakdown was helpful, please share this video. These things take a lot of work to put together, and word of mouth is a great way to support channels like this one. And remember, this is just a very basic intro to solo survivability. If you want to dive deeper, join the Ninja Pulse Discord and start a conversation. Also, check out Hyperioxy's channel and website. He is the premier source of tanking content and guides for ESO, and he also does a lot of advanced solo stuff. You can also stop by the Ninja Pulse Twitch channel and talk to me and Maya anytime. I'm on most days, so come say hi. In the meantime, thanks for watching, enjoy the KAKU trailer, and I'll see you in the next one.
Long ago, a divine creator named Saga shaped balance through the 4 elements. But one day, a mysterious force from another world emerged, and everything fell apart. The world shattered into 4 devastated realms, each ruled by a corrupted lord. Now, only one hope remains. A young boy, KAKU. Unaware of the prophecy, but chosen by fate. With the help of a flying pig, loyal and full of surprises, KAKU must face the legacy of a broken world. To save this world, to restore the balance, KAKU must awaken the power within. A legend is about to be reborn. KAKU, Ancient Seal. The adventure begins.